Good morning, fellow humanists. My name is Todd Kimball, and I'll be your MC this morning. I've had about a 6-week hiatus from this role as I had some major health problems, but very happy to be here. Still nowhere near 100%, but I will try and bring 100% effort to you this morning. A reminder that humanism is a rational philosophy informed by science, inspired by art, and motivated by compassion. It advocates the extension of participatory democracy and the expansion of an open society standing for human rights and social justice. Our reader this morning is Mr. Mike Blaylock. Come on in, Mike.
I was going to read a little this morning from a book entitled Primates and Philosophers. It's How Morality Evolved. That human morality elaborates upon pre-existing tendencies is, of course, the central theme of this volume. The debate with my colleagues made me think of Wilson's recommendation 3 decades ago that the time has come for ethics to be removed temporarily from the hands of philosophers and biologicized. We currently seem in the middle of this process, not by pushing philosophers aside, but by including them so that the evolutionary basis of human morality can be illuminated from a variety of disciplinary angles. To neglect the common ground with other primates and to deny the evolutionary roots of human morality would be like arriving at the top of a tower to declare that the rest of the building is irrelevant. That the precious concept of tower ought to be reserved for its summit. While making for good academic fights, semantics are mostly a waste of time. Are animals moral? Let us simply conclude that they occupy several floors of the tower of morality. Rejecting even of this modest proposal can only result in an impoverished view of the structure as a whole.
Well, thank you, Mike. Now I will introduce our speaker. As water becomes a scarcer resource, its use and allocation is going to become more critical and political. Joining us this morning to talk about the modernization of our groundwater allocation process is Ivan Gall. Mr. Gall is the interim deputy director for the Oregon Water Resources Department. He is a hydrologist by training and a registered geologist in Oregon. Ivan has worked in the Water Resources Department for 25 years in many different roles and locations, working from Grants Pass to Baker City and now in Salem. Let's have a warm yet muted welcome from our Zoom audience and a rousing ovation from those at the friendly house for Mr. Ivan Gall.
Thank you, Todd. Quite a warm welcome there, and it's great to be here with everybody. I appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to speak. I've got a PowerPoint presentation here that I'll share shortly that we can kind of work through, that'll touch and hopefully answer questions and get to the main topic of our modernization of our groundwater allocation policy. I'll certainly explain what that is, as it may be foreign to some. As Todd mentioned, I'm a kind of a groundwater scientist by training. I do a lot of different things for the agency now. I've worked in both Western Oregon and Eastern Oregon over my career with the agency and have had the opportunity to see water management play out in different landscapes around the state, and to see how, state policies over the years have worked and in some cases haven't worked so well. And we can touch on that. I think with that, I'll go ahead and get started. I talked to David earlier today. I'm happy to take questions throughout the talk. We should also have plenty of time at the end of the talk there. So if you guys can feed questions in, if you have any to David or Todd, that would be great. And I'll pause periodically just to see if there's anything there. So we wanted to get to the question of modernization of Oregon groundwater allocation process here in the state. I think in order to do that, I wanted to give you guys a quick primer on water rights in Oregon, some of the historical perspectives, and also what we call exempt uses of water in the state that don't require water rights. Then we'll get to the allocation process, some of the challenges we're facing, some of the ideas we have, and wrap it up with questions. So from a historical perspective, our water code dates back to 1909, so well over 100 years. I think fundamentally the reason that the state put the water code into place is that even at that point in history, there was a tremendous amount of water use on some of our stream systems, particularly those in Eastern Oregon. Some of the streams were overused to the point that there were scarcity already, and problems from that. Conflict arose, in some cases extreme conflict. And so the state stepped in and tried to organize a structure by which future allocation of new water could be done in more of an organized fashion, and also existing uses could be managed under state authority. Oregon follows the doctrine of prior appropriation. So we call that first in time, first in right. The first people who used it are senior users on a stream system, and progressively more and more junior users came online. In times of shortage, water masters will go out there and regulate off junior users to make sure that the senior users have priority and get the water to which they're entitled. In 1927, there was a groundwater code passed east of the Cascades. So groundwater development, which was pretty early for groundwater development, started to get some level of recognition in the late 1920s there. It wasn't until 1955 that the statewide Groundwater Act was passed, along with something called minimum perennial flows. And these were flows set up on certain stream or river systems that recognized we should maintain some level of water flow in these streams or rivers at a base level and protect that as such. 20 some years later, 30 some years later, in 1987, was the 1987 In-Stream Water Rights Act. And that became the first time in Oregon law that we actually set up a structure where agencies like Parks and Recreation, Department of Environmental Quality, and largely Department of Fish and Wildlife could they themselves apply for in-stream water rights to protect flows in certain streams or reaches of streams around the state to meet either recreational requirements, habitat, fish and wildlife requirements, or in the case of DEQ, try and maintain or improve water quality in those surface water bodies there. Do you need a water right? Well, we have what we call our three-part test. Is water of the state involved in your use? For the most part, the answer is yes. All groundwater in the state is classified as waters of the state, and almost all surface water. So streams, rivers, large spring complexes that flow into streams and rivers, those are all considered waters of the state. What's not considered waters of the state? You're allowed to collect water off of an impervious surface on your property, like a roof, or if you wanted to cover a piece of your ground with visqueen, concrete pads, things like that, you're allowed to collect that water and use it as you see fit without needing a water right in the state. Do you control the use of that water or in some way the diversion of it? So do you pump it? Do you feed the water into a ditch? Do you store the water in a pond or reservoir? That's another criteria that we look at. And then the third part of this three-part test is there an intent to make beneficial use of the water? And beneficial use is very broadly defined in the state. Common beneficial uses that we see would be irrigation of crops, human consumption, municipal use, industrial or commercial use, watering of stock, things like that are the common and large beneficial uses that we see across the state. Getting into some of the other basic kind of foundations of Oregon water law, I mentioned earlier we follow the doctrine of prior appropriation. That's common through many of the Western states, our more arid states here in the United States. Back on the East Coast, they typically follow something called riparian rights. So if a stream flows through your property, you're allowed to just throw a pump in and begin using that. In Oregon, again, we have that three-part test to determine if you need a water right. Large difference out here in the West is that we have that long, dry period of time from the late spring into the early fall, where we get very little precipitation. And that's a time where surface water supplies historically shrunk quite a bit, and we got into the controversy, and there just wasn't water available to meet all the out-of-stream consumptive needs there. Another foundation of Oregon water law is beneficial use without waste. If you're issued a permit from the state for irrigation to use surface water or groundwater, then you have to put that water to a beneficial use. In this case, the example I used was irrigation. You would apply it to a set place of use at a predetermined rate. You also get a volume limitation for the year in many cases. What if you don't need all of that water? Well, you can't pump it to waste. You can't apply excessive water. And so that's where we try and provide some level of limitation and minimize wasteful use of water in the state. Next term here is kind of an unusual one, appurtenance. Most water rights are appurtenant to a specific location. So they're tied to the land. Again, the largest uses of water in the state tend to be irrigation rights. In some cases, they cover broad swaths of land. You can think of some of the larger irrigation districts in the state that may cover tens of thousands of acres. Those water rights are tied to specific footprints set to a certain number of acres. When necessary, they can be transferred. You can move water rights around, but when initially issued, they'll be tied to a piece of ground, and that's the place of use in which you need to exercise that water right. If I were to issue a water right for, say, 10 acres, and after 5 years you wanted to water a different 10 acres, you would have to apply for a water right transfer to pick up those original 10 acres, shift them over, and set them back down on a new 10 acres of land, and then begin irrigation on that new piece of property. Oregon is also a state that considers a forfeiture of water rights. One of the basic, I guess, building blocks of our water code is that it was really designed to develop new uses for all the great things that we do when we use water out there. And if you weren't going to use your water, then you need to get out of the way and let somebody else use that allocation of water. And so the way the water code was set up is if you don't put your water to use for 5 consecutive years, then it's going to be subject to forfeiture. So it's this use it or lose it part of our water code. And it's not something that is exercised very broadly. It's very contentious when someone asserts that non-use has occurred on a piece of property and a water right should be forfeited. It typically results in some sort of a conflict that we call a contested case, where all the facts are brought before an administrative law judge, and the administrative law judge would come up with a ruling on the facts in front of them. So we don't have the resources to chase after that as an agency, but where we do see it come into play is typically disputes between different neighbors. And if one of them has a water right, it might be something that we see where the additional neighbor asserts non-use and tries to cancel the water right of the neighboring property there. So I wanted to touch on exempt uses of water. These are also uses of water for which you don't need a water right from the state of Oregon. Just looking at these quickly, things like fish screens, fishways, and fish bypass structures. So if you have to put some engineering infrastructure into a stream like a dam, you don't need a water right to run water through a fish ladder, as an example. I mentioned earlier the rainwater from an artificial impervious surface. You can capture that and collect it. Emergency firefighting is exempt. Forest management practices, so Department of Forestry or U.S. Forest Service, BLM, can get some modest uses of water for that. Also, land management practices. We've recognized the value of soil over the years following the Dust Bowl there. And so any practices that look to conserve soil, different plowing techniques, or ways to contour around a hill that might temporarily slow or impede the runoff of water, those are not required to have water rights and also can apply to water quality improvements there. And I mentioned livestock watering. That's important to our ranching community out there across the state. A cow, obviously, of their own free will oftentimes walk up on a piece of property and step into the stream or adjacent to the stream to get a drink of water. That has been happening for as long as we've had cows in the state. We've recognized over the decades that there can be some water quality impacts from grazing adjacent to streams. And so practices have been put in place to try and fence off riparian zones, keep cattle out of the stream. And some of those practices are exempt from needing a water right. So those, again, are surface water exemptions. Moving on to some of the key exempt uses of groundwater. So this would be groundwater that you'd be pumping from a well. Stock water is exempt for groundwater. That means that you can pump water out to provide drinking water to 10 head of cattle or 10,000 head of cattle. There's not a limitation on the amount. We allow up to 15,000 gallons per day for single or group domestic use. And with respect to domestic uses in groups of homes, our experience has shown that 15,000 gallons a day is plenty to serve around 30 homes. A business is allowed to have 5,000 gallons per day use for industrial or commercial use. The big one that comes up quite a bit is irrigation of up to 1/2 acre of lawn or non-commercial garden. So a lot of rural residential properties across Oregon have groundwater as their source of water. They're allowed to irrigate up to 1/2 acre in combination for their landscaping and garden if they have one. That's a violation that we find from time to time where people put in bigger yards or larger gardens. And I'll note here, it's also non-commercial. So with the rapid increase in recreational cannabis operations in the state, both legal and illegal, these exempt wells have been a very useful source of water for cannabis operations, but they're a commercial use. So really in Oregon, in order to irrigate a cannabis crop or any commercial crop from a well, you need to have a groundwater right from the state of Oregon to do so. And in addition to these, there's 3 other seldom used exemptions. One quick example is like downhole heat exchange for heat pumps.
And Ivan, before we move to the next slide, we have a question at the Friendly House from Jeff Strang.
Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Ivan. I remember years ago when I was helping a friend set up a farm in Lynn County, and we just put the pipe in the stream, Santiam River, and started pumping. Is there a water resource officer that goes around to all the farms with water rights and determines how much they're withdrawing from surface waters?
Thanks, Jeff. Good question. So our field staff here at the Water Resources Department do that job, if you will, in a number of different ways. The state and our Oregon water law actually calls out specific employees, what we call water masters, and they are the staff that manage and regulate water on a daily basis across the state. Currently in Oregon, we've broken the state up into, make sure I get my numbers right, I believe we're up to 23 water master districts now. So a good example, Joel's my water master. He'll handle a lot of Polk and northern Benton County, kind of on the west side of the Willamette Valley. And then Greg handles the east side of the Willamette here and around the Salem area. But again, the state's been broken up into 23, 24 water master districts. They would get at that issue, Jeff, in a couple of different ways. Usually during the irrigation season, our staff will float the larger navigable streams and look for pumps or ditches, dams, what we call diversions, and they'll gather information on those locations, go back to the office and make sure that those are authorized uses. In times of shortage, when the water masters get called out to do regulation, they will stop onto the farm itself and talk to the landowners. They'll look at flow meters, where those are installed, or other types of measuring devices to make sure that the irrigator is diverting at the appropriate rate and putting that water again on the appropriate acres. That gets back to that appurtenancy discussion we had earlier. So I hope that answers your question. And if not, get back at me here.
Great. Thanks a lot. That helps.
You bet. So now we're going to switch gears. Now that you're all experts on Oregon water law and water rights here in the state, we're going to go ahead and move into our allocation process update. And by allocation, what we're talking about doing is looking forward. When someone like Jeff comes into our office and says, hey, I just bought 10 acres. I would like to get a new water right on my property. Can I do that? What's the process? So that's the allocation process. And today, since 1909, that process works in a pretty simple way where someone who's interested in getting a water right, be it a surface water right, a groundwater right, or perhaps a water right to store water in a reservoir, files an application with the Water Resources Department. We review that application. That application is also reviewed by ODFW, Department of Fish and Wildlife, and the Department of Environmental Quality. They have interest in making sure that the new proposed use doesn't further impact stream temperature or water quality, that it doesn't impact fish passage or water available for fish species. And that application then goes through kind of a procedural review to make sure all the I's are dotted and T's are crossed, and also a technical review. And what we'll be talking about the rest of this morning is specifically new applications for groundwater development across the state. And those are important in the sense that groundwater is and was essentially the last frontier of available water for use in Oregon. We have a surface water availability model, and I've got a slide that'll show you some of that data later on. But most of Oregon, I think, as you're well aware, because of the amount of development that has occurred on streams and river systems already, and the water shortages we get through drought or just overall scarcity, it's very challenging across most of the state to find any surface water available, certainly during the dry months in the state. So people over the years turned to groundwater. We saw that the Groundwater Act came into being in 1955. Well, what else came in around 1955? We started to get electrification out into rural areas. We developed better drilling technologies where we could drill bigger and deeper wells to access deeper, harder to get to aquifer systems around the state. Groundwater pumping technology improved through the 50s and 60s. And so what we started to see in the 1960s and 70s and on through our current day is that groundwater development has occurred across the state to varying degrees in different basins. It generally has occurred in areas where there are large regional aquifer systems that produce a lot of groundwater. They justify the cost of putting in an expensive well. And also in areas where water is available and we have irrigable lands. So in Oregon, depending on the basin you're in, roughly 80 to 90% of the water authorized for use goes towards agriculture and irrigation. That's what grows crops for direct human consumption, or a lot of hay and forage crops for cattle and other animals out there. I think today between the cattle industry and the hay and forage industry, I think their overall, gross revenues top $1 billion a year. So it's a very big industry across the state here. What became apparent over time is like surface water, where we've overallocated that, and in times of shortage, we have to shut off junior users. In some basins of the state, or in some aquifer systems within basins of the state, we've overallocated groundwater. We've issued too many groundwater rights, and that results in usually one of two things happening, and we'll talk about those. So there's been a drive afoot within our agency the last 2 to 3 years to update this allocation process and make sure that the technical review that we do ensures that groundwater is available for this new proposed use without impacting existing groundwater users out there and impacting existing surface water users. So really what I'm showing on this slide here is that this process is going to update the assessment of water availability. Is water available for this new future use? And it's designed to protect existing users and also improve the sustainability of groundwater. And by sustainability of groundwater, we don't want to start mining the resource out, and we know we're mining it out when groundwater levels start to drop. This allocation process update is not going to affect any of those exempt groundwater uses we talked about earlier, or the exempt use wells that are across the state. It's not going to affect any kind of regulation of existing water rights, and it's not going to affect that water right transfer process that I mentioned earlier, where someone wants to make a change to their water rights. This is a rough timeline of where we've been and where we're heading. We started this process back about a year ago, roughly. In spring of 2022, we came up with concepts for a new groundwater allocation policy. This summer, our commission directed us to go out and gather additional public input. And so in the fall, myself and Justin Iverson, who manages our groundwater section, and a number of our other staff held 5 kind of town hall meetings. We did one down in Medford, one in Bend, one over in LeGrand, and 2 of them here in Salem. All of them were hybrid meetings, as this one is. And we kind of laid out this information for folks and asked for feedback. We asked for feedback at the meeting and gave folks an opportunity to provide additional comment. This upcoming spring, we think in April, we're going to convene a rule advisory committee, and that would be to start crafting new rules and working towards adoption of rules. And then we'd like to get to, by the end of this calendar year, adoption of rules by the Water Resources Commission. And the way new rules are adopted in the Water Resources Department, usually staff are driving that bus. We go through this rule advisory committee process. Rules are registered with the Secretary of State. There's a public comment period. Anybody in the public can comment on these. The department then takes those comments into consideration, makes any modifications to the rules, and then takes those rules to the Water Resources Commission, which is a 7-person body that's appointed by the governor. And the commission will vote to adopt those rules or not adopt them, or perhaps adopt them with modifications. So in order to talk about groundwater allocation and some of the shortcomings with our current process and some of the potential fixes, we're going to have a little primer on key groundwater concepts. So I'm going to run you all now through kind of a quick look at what is groundwater, how does groundwater behave in the hydrologic cycle, and really importantly then, what's the source of groundwater to pumping wells, and why is that so important to understand? What you're looking at here in the photograph, I believe this is the Metolius Basin there. That's a large spring complex discharging out of some relatively young volcanic rocks into the Metolius River there. So a very obvious manifestation of groundwater being hydraulically connected to surface water, and why that's such an important concept we'll get to here. So what is groundwater? You've got kind of a cartoon diagram in front of you here today. Groundwater is basically water that's below the level of the water table, and it fills pore spaces in the subsurface. In some cases, those pore spaces are sands, gravels, silts, and clays that have been deposited by rivers and streams over the years. In other cases, we have older geologic formations here in Oregon that are made up of bedrock, and that bedrock then has been subsequently fractured, and that creates what we call some secondary porosity and permeability. Water can get into those fractures and then be transmitted through those. We have a number of volcanic aquifer systems, really on both flanks, the east flank and the west flank of the Cascade mountain range, and in other different parts of the state. And those volcanic aquifers are very important as well. But again, the general concept is saturation of pore space below the water table. And I'll just note for you here, let me see if I can get my cursor going there. Here you can see the water table dipping down and connecting with the surface water body there. And that's an important connection that we'll touch on a number of times. So the hydrologic cycle. This is a nice graphic from the US Geological Survey. They've actually just updated this, and made it more complex. So we continue to use this. It shows what we want it to show. Water in the hydrologic cycle is always moving. And that's a really key concept. I'll see if I can kind of drive this here. So we begin in the oceans. As temperatures warm, we're evaporating water from the surface of the ocean. You can see then it's moved overland through the atmosphere, and it drops in different ways. Rainfall, the San Francisco Bay Area has seen this with the atmospheric rivers the last few weeks. Precipitation higher in the mountains. This is typical in the mountain ranges here in Oregon. And then at higher elevation, particularly during the winter months, we get accumulation of snow and then eventually some sort of runoff or melt off. Depending on the nature of the geology in a basin and the amount of precipitation that occurs, some percentage of the runoff then infiltrates into the aquifer system and begins a journey, in some cases a relatively short journey. You can see a short journey here, and then it comes back out as seepage. Here's something else that comes out as a spring complex, or perhaps direct groundwater discharge to a lake. We see this happening in Upper Klamath Lake down in Klamath County. In other cases, this pathway is much longer and it goes deeper into the aquifer system, and in some cases may eventually discharge directly out to the ocean or to other groundwater discharge areas. But it's really the key takeaway on this is that all of this moisture movement, water movement is part of a cycle. And there are various ways along these pathways that humankind is able to disrupt that. We can put a dam in a river and we can pull water out that was normally going to flow to the ocean, and we can put it to some beneficial use. Or we can drill a well and we can capture groundwater that's moving from a recharge area to a discharge area, and we can put that groundwater to a beneficial use. But that's a new stress or disruption onto that hydrologic cycle that wasn't part of the original construct in that particular basin there. Again, another simple kind of a concept here. What we're showing here is that there's a broad recharge area across land surface. You can see the water table below land surface here, and these arrows represent groundwater flow paths that are heading from the recharge areas down towards the discharge area. Remember, it's always moving. And in this case, the discharge area is a stream adjacent to this landscape. How do we know we have groundwater in streams? Well, any of you that spend time outdoors, particularly late in the summer, August, September, October, almost all of our stream basins in the state have no melting glaciers or snowpack remaining by the end of summer. That's just a thing of the past. And so when you go out to Eastern Oregon and you're out around Baker City and there's a small stream there with 2 or 3 cubic feet per second in it, you look up in the mountains, there's no snow, there's no melting glaciers, there hasn't been rain in 4 months. That is groundwater. It's groundwater that seeps into that stream system. Where are streams at? They're at the lowest point topographically in a basin. And so they act as a drain, if you will, to that aquifer system that they're hydraulically connected to. In some cases, this groundwater base flow, as we call it, is quite amazing. The Metolius River is a great example. Within a few miles of the headwaters of the Metolius, there's over 1,000 cubic feet per second flowing in the river system there. That's all groundwater discharge. I'm sorry, I'm using some jargon here. A cubic foot per second is literally a cube of water that's 1 foot on each side passing by you, one of those per second, and it's equal to about 450 gallons per minute. A garden hose running full blast is about 10 to 15 gallons a minute. So 1 CFS, 1 cubic foot per second, is quite a bit of water. That's enough water here in this state to irrigate somewhere between 80 and maybe 100 acres of land, depending on your application rate there. So wanted to talk, I mentioned earlier, the source of water to pumping wells. And this kind of gets into a combination of hydrogeology and physics, but we'll skip the physics part. Again, we have our simple cartoon diagram here that we had before, but in this case now we've drilled a well. And this well is pumping at some discharge rate Q1. You remember before the flow paths were heading down and discharge was occurring at the stream. Well, now we have some discharge occurring to the stream, but we also have some discharge occurring at the well. And you can imagine that if the well is close enough to the stream and pumps enough water and pumps for a long enough period of time, that we may start to have a growing rate of impact on the stream. And that's exactly what happens here. You'll notice this change in shape of the water table. Many of you may have heard the term cone of depression. That's not where a farmer gets depressed because their well doesn't pump enough water. That's actually a change in the shape of the water table here. And this is where the physics comes in. In order to pull water out of the well, we have to change the hydraulic gradient, if you will, or slope of that gradient to push more water into the well. And you can see that some of these flow paths are actually flowing into the well, and this would be occurring in a radial fashion from all directions into that well, assuming it was a uniformly permeable aquifer material there. But again, we've created this new stress. That's Q1. We're developing water now for a beneficial use. And that's had some impacts. It's changed the shape of the water table. And it looks like we're starting to capture water that used to discharge to the stream. So water, there's 2 sources of water to a pumping well. And this was recognized as early as the late 1930s by a gentleman, C.V. Tice, who's kind of one of the granddaddies of modern hydrogeology. I showed you how the water table changes configuration. What we've done is we've dewatered a portion of that aquifer system adjacent to the well. It's no longer saturated. This is saturated over here. This portion with the red hatcher marks has been dewatered. We've withdrawn groundwater from storage in this area. We've also changed those flow paths, and now we're starting to draw water in from the stream. So we've captured water that was discharging to the stream. And we're going to get into this in a little bit more detail and see how this ratio of changes in storage in the aquifer system to changes of capture kind of change over time. This is another USGS publication that came out in 2012. It's a good read, and there's some beautiful photographs in it, so I'd encourage you all to look it up online. All of these USGS publications are available as PDFs online. But I'll walk you through this graph here and share with you why this is so important for us. What we're looking at is just time increasing to the right, non-dimensional time. And the vertical axis is a percentage of groundwater pumping rate. And if we're pumping no groundwater, there's nothing happening. Once we turn on a well, I showed you the change in the water table. Initially, as we turn on that well, as time is close to 0 there, most of the water coming into the well is water that's removed from storage in that aquifer system. So that's what creates the change in the water table and dewaters sediments adjacent to the well. As time progresses, the percentage of water coming out of that well that's coming from storage in the aquifer decreases, and it's eventually going to approach 0. What is increasing then to balance that is the amount of water from stream flow depletion. So we turn the well on. You can imagine a well that's several hundred yards from the creek, maybe a mile from the creek. Initially, there's going to be very little impact to stream flow, but as time progresses and that well continues to pump at a constant rate, the amount of water that's captured from stream flow depletion starts to approach 100% of the pumping rate of that well. So if a well is pumping at 10 gallons a minute and the system eventually reaches some sort of long-term equilibrium, then there would be 10 gallons of stream flow depletion at long periods of time. And that's just important concept to get that not only is the location of a well relative to surface water important, how long the well pumps and how much the well pumps all play a factor in impacts to surface water bodies from groundwater development. This was Mr. Tice's, excuse me, his quote from 1940. From the standpoint of groundwater conservation and statutory or other regulation, that's the state of Oregon stepping in with our water code, the following point should be emphasized. All water discharged by wells is balanced by a loss of water somewhere. In my words, that means there's no free lunch. That's the typical phrase I use around the state as I'm talking to people. We can't pump groundwater, just like you can't pump directly from a stream without there being some sort of an impact to the system. And that impact, again, manifests itself in one of two ways. We're either going to capture water on its way to discharge to a spring or a lake or a stream, or alternatively, we're going to be in a certain type of an aquifer system that may not be very hydraulically connected to streams. And as a result of that, we will start to mine out the groundwater resource and groundwater levels will decline. So you're looking at a couple maps of the state of Oregon here. On the left is a map that our groundwater section and groundwater scientists have put together using a number of different data sets. It's a groundwater areas of concern map. The little tiny squares you see on there are full townships. So those are 6 miles by 6 miles on a side, 36 square miles, kind of to help you with the scale. And the different color tones on there show areas of either significant concern, maybe areas where the aquifers are just going to be yield limited, meaning the geology is not very productive to produce a lot of groundwater. And then the gray, which is a lot of it, is we just don't have much data available there. The yellow outlines are groundwater restricted areas where we've already had groundwater issues and we've put some controls or constraints in place. The blue outlined areas are state scenic waterways. So there's restrictions on impacts to scenic waterways within those basins. And then the black lines are our administrative basins by county there. On the right, I mentioned our surface water availability model earlier. This is a model output, if you will, of the state of Oregon for August. The month of August, we have one of these maps for each month of the year. Where it's yellow, it's showing that in the month of August, there's no surface water available for that particular stream basin. Where there's purple and deeper shades of purple, there is some water available, and you can see that that's fairly limited to some of the coastal basins and to the Willamette Valley main stem. Largely because of the large surface water impoundments or reservoirs we have on that system there, and a little bit up in Northeast Oregon as well. So that's the end of the primer on groundwater. That kind of lays out some of the issues that our hydrogeologists face when they have to review a new application for groundwater use to make sure that water is available. So I'm going to take you through a few more slides here to kind of talk about some of the historical challenges and some of the issues that we're facing today, and then some of the ideas we're thinking about that might help us resolve these. What you're looking at here is what we call a hydrograph. So this is a plot of groundwater level elevation data for the Harney Basin over near Burns, Oregon. We've got a timeline of 1960 through 2020. So these are relatively recent data on the right. And then the vertical scale is groundwater elevation in feet above mean sea level. And what's key here is from the 1960s through the early to mid 1990s, you can see that the few data points we have were relatively stable. And then things started to change. About the mid 90s, you can see this one well, water levels are starting to drop, kind of continues on over here and continues on down this way. As we realized there was some issues going on, we started to pick up additional wells and do some additional monitoring. And you can see a pretty significant trend down. Oregon statutes, back to the water code, require that the state maintain reasonably stable groundwater levels. That might mean something different to me than it does to you. We'll talk about that. But this is an example of an aquifer system in the Harney Basin there, where allocation of groundwater, largely for center pivot irrigation of alfalfa, has gone beyond the annual recharge amount for that aquifer system. And so groundwater is being mined from storage within the aquifer. And when that happens, water levels drop with time. When our hydrogeologists get a new application in for groundwater, they take a relatively small scale and short-term look at the potential impacts from that new application. This is just a quick map, aerial view, topographic map. There was a proposed well located here. This would be a 1/4 mile circle and then a 1 mile circle around that. And our rules that we've been allocating groundwater under for years, again, tend to or have pushed us into looking at short-term impacts in relatively close proximity to where that application's at. You can see there's a stream off to the east of this location here. And then there's a number of well locations up in this area. This would be in Lane County. Each of these green dots represents a unique well there. And we might have some data up here on the geology of the area, some of the water level trends if we have water level data for these wells. And then the agency hydrogeologist will take a look at all of this, assess the potential impact from this new proposed use based on all the information in front of us, and come up with a technical finding that this will or will not have the potential for substantial interference with the stream. That has some meaning there, and will or will not cause injury to other users in the area. And so the historical practice of looking at short-term nearby impacts only has allowed us to allocate more groundwater in some basins than we should have. And that previous slide with Harney was an example there. Again, here's the statewide map of groundwater concerns. A couple of takeaways here. Under the current review process, more than 70% of our groundwater applications result in a permit being issued. And approximately 80% of the applications actually occur in some of these groundwater areas of concern. And so we're continuing to issue a fairly high percentage of permits, and also in areas where we have some of these concerns. And that's what has been driving us to get to a modernization of this process here and try and improve it where it's going to be more protective of senior users, both surface water and groundwater users out there, and make sure that when we allocate new groundwater, we're doing so in a sustainable fashion. Again, this concept of hydraulic connection between a pumping well and a nearby stream. We don't want to further deplete already over appropriated surface waters. And the current rules that we use to assess the impact from a new proposed well and its impact on surface water, again, have distance constraints and time constraints on it that allow us to continue issuing permits that have small, but in a cumulative sense, probably important impact on these already fully appropriated or over appropriated surface water bodies. This is a different way at looking at stream depletion with time. This is using an analytical, or what we call a spreadsheet model. What we're looking at here is the percentage of stream depletion that occurs over time, and this is in months of periods of running this equation basically. And you can see we're simulating 3 different streams: Whitechoose Creek, the Deschutes River, and the Crooked River. This well is located much closer to the Crooked and much further away from Whitechoose Creek. And what we're looking at here when we run this is a stream depletion increases relatively consistently and at a higher rate for impacts to the Crooked River, and at a much lower rate for the Deschutes River and Whitechoose Creek there. So this is an example of a tool that we have to do some assessments. And it also shows that a pumping well can impact obviously more than one surface water system if it's hydraulically connected in that particular basin there. One of the concepts we're looking at to modernize now, kind of shifting gears, we recognize the existing system isn't ideal. How are we going to improve it? One concept we have is going back to that surface water availability model and asking the question, should we be issuing new groundwater rights in basins where, at least in August of this depiction, there's no surface water available? Well, most of the Rogue Basin really doesn't have surface water available for new surface water rights all of the summer months, probably from April through October, maybe even into November. Does it make sense to issue a new groundwater right down in the Rogue Basin that would have a small impact on a nearby stream, but that stream is already over appropriated, and there may be senior surface water right holders on that stream that don't get the water to which they're entitled? So that's one of the concepts, is trying to work into our review process at a more robust level, the surface water availability across the state. So we talked about water masters. Water masters get numerous calls during the summer months from senior users in particular. Hey, Joel, this is Bob. I'm over on Evans Creek. I'm not getting my water. Can you get out and do some regulation and make sure I get my water? So a water master will research the water rights in question, make sure that the farmer's entitled to that water, and then go out and shut off junior users. This is a map of the state broken out by the large basins. These are the priority dates between 2018 and 2020 here, when we were doing the work and tracking some data. These priority dates are the years that we regulated back to. So in the Goose and Summer Lake, in that 3-year period of time, we had to regulate back as far as 1885 water rights in order to get a senior user the water to which they're entitled. You can see in wetter parts of the state, the regulation doesn't have to go back as far as it does on the east side. But on the east side of the state, we're largely back into the 1800s on a fairly regular basis each year. And that includes Umpqua and Rogue. And the Klamath is brown here. The regulation we're doing down in the Klamath Basin has largely been around Klamath tribes, in-stream determined claims. They have a priority date of time immemorial, so they predate all others. And we've regulated large chunks of the Klamath Basin in order to protect those in-stream claims. Another look to get to the question of reasonably stable. Are groundwater levels reasonably stable? That's what the statute requires the Water Resources Department to do. This is a series of wells in the Mount Angel groundwater limited area. These gray boxes are townships. So again, 6 miles by 6 miles. The outline of the orange here is the Mount Angel groundwater limited area, which is a little bit north and east of Salem here. The hydrograph on the right, again, groundwater level data from a number of wells. Time scale is the early 1990s up through 2021, 22. And then the vertical scale, again, is elevation of that groundwater table in feet above mean sea level. And you can see in this basalt aquifer system, groundwater levels have come down. They started up a little bit and then came back down again. Is that reasonably stable? Well, in roughly 30 years, we've gone from aquifer heads of about 100 feet down to below 60 feet. So we've lost more than a foot per year in that period of time. Jumping across the Cascades to the Deschutes Basin, we've got a series of wells here, and I'll show you a hydrograph in the next slide. These are wells that are closer to the Cascades. Note this, these little squiggly lines, this is a Sisters Fault Zone. So that's a big geologically structural area there. And then wells off to the east, this is the town of Redmond here, and then Powell Butte out here. So we're looking at a kind of a complex hydrograph here, a number of different wells, and you see a lot of different things going on. Those wells that I said are near the Cascade Mountains to the west, you can see significant recharge here, some perturbations going on in the 2000s, some decline going on here, and then some recovery going on. So these wells near the Cascades seem to follow climate trends pretty well. This red well followed that climate trend pretty good. And then around the mid-2000s, it deviated from that, more of a flatline response here. As we progress east towards Redmond, you can see here on the right, we're within the Sisters Fault Zone with this red well. Now these other wells are east of the Sisters Fault Zone. They're on some level of downward trend, half a foot per year down here to about as much as 1 foot per year. Again, over the years, it adds up. This one has declined almost 30 feet since 1996 there. So in 25 to 26 years, we've lost about a foot per year there. So again, as we ask the question, what does reasonably stable mean? It's not defined in statute. We're going to need to figure something out in order to move this process forward. So again, the outreach across the state, we were looking to solicit input from citizens as to how we should evaluate applications for new groundwater rights that are going to be more protective of existing users out there and maintain that resource in a sustainable fashion so we can continue to use it into the future. That rules process will probably initiate sometime in April. If some of the listeners here today are interested in serving on a rule advisory committee, it's a fairly rewarding task. There's a lot of reading to do, but with a group of stakeholders that have had a lot of interest in water. You know, I'm happy to take any questions today. These were kind of the ones that we left the listening groups with, again, out there, how to protect senior water right holders. And what's this time scale for sustainable mean to you? Do you want your kids to have some groundwater left? How about your grandkids? How about your great grandkids? Or should we truly manage it in a sustainable fashion where that decline rate is very close to zero? I talked about next steps. We'll be convening this rule advisory committee, hopefully in April of this year. And then we're really shooting for proposed rule adoption by the Water Resources Commission in late 2023, near the end of this calendar year. Our commission typically meets 4 times a year, so we're sort of on a quarterly basis, and we'd be looking to hit that last meeting of 2023. And that is it for me, and I will go ahead and stop sharing here.
Ivan, thank you so much for a very thorough and understandable and engaging presentation this morning. Excellent job. I'll go ahead and read a couple of questions from the chat that have come in the last 20 minutes or so, and then we'll get to the floor for questions both from Friendly House and from our Zoom audience. Hank Robb wanted to know, what makes the change from water table to groundwater?
Hank, if I'm understanding your question there, the kind of the transition is a level of saturation. And so above the water table, there is soil and moisture, but not all the pore space is fully saturated. There's actually somewhat less kind of a negative pressure in there, and that might be the root zone where plants and plant roots are transpiring moisture there. But the key is that from the water table down deeper into the aquifer system, everything is effectively saturated. So I hope that answers your question.
So if someone says there's a high water table versus a low water table, they're talking about level of saturation versus how deep you are into the ground?
Yes, when I hear the term high water table, I start thinking that you might need a sump pump in your basement to dewater it, to keep that level of water down, where a low water table is something that you might need to dig several feet below land surface, or several tens of feet, or even hundreds of feet. In the Deschutes Basin, I showed you those hydrographs there at the end. I think out near Redmond, the depth to water is many hundreds of feet down. So there's largely an unsaturated column of volcanic sediments, stream and lake sediments out there that's unsaturated. So any recharge that falls on that land surface has to percolate down hundreds of feet before it reaches the water table and becomes part of that groundwater system.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
And before I get to our next question from chat, I will point out a link that David McMillan put in the chat called Stream Flow Depletion by Wells. It's a government report. So thank you for that, David. And now we have a question from the chat from Willie. She says, I live in Washington County. Can I just dig a well for my own irrigation?
Depends on how much irrigation you're after there. So anywhere in the state of Oregon, that exempt groundwater use allows you to irrigate up to a half a gallon, or sorry, a half an acre of lawn or non-commercial garden. So you're able to do that based on state water. If you want to go beyond a half acre or raise a commercial crop, you need a ground.
No, I have a half acre. That's all I have.
Yep. So you're allowed to drill a well. Now, Washington County is pretty densely populated. There are some municipalities that have a
county. I'm just in the county. I'm not in the city.
Yeah, but some areas have expensive municipal water, and folks have tried to drill wells in cities and towns.
Yeah, that's me.
There's restrictions there by their current water provider. They certainly don't want any, what we call a cross connection between your well water, which potentially could be contaminated, and the city drinking water system. So that's just something to be aware of out there.
But I could just set it up so it would be for irrigation and not come into I still want to drink city water. And
yes.
Then I want to water my garden and fruit trees and everything with well water. And that's legal. I guess I thought we weren't allowed to do that privately anymore.
That is legal. There are a couple areas, Cooper Bull Mountain, and there's another limited area. I'm sorry I don't have the names readily.
I'm near Cooper Mountain.
Okay, yeah, and there are restrictions there that the parcel size had to be, I believe, a minimum of 10 acres in order for you to drill a new well. The reason there is that those are basalt aquifer systems. They're prone to overdraft, like we saw in that Mount Angel example. And even with residential uses, we started to create some declines in that water table system out there.
If I wanted to call Washington County and ask these questions, who would I ask for?
You'd want to ask for the Washington County Water Master Office. And you're located out there in Hillsborough, and can provide you that information.
Okay, thank you.
She says residential property that relies on well water will also probably have a septic field, which will contribute water to the water available. Is this input regarded as meaningful?
Yeah, so that's a good example of kind of a pass-through system. Most of the rural residential folks that I talked about out there and used as examples do have a combination of an exempt well and usually an on-site septic system that disposes of their in-house uses. So what we would call gray water and black water from the toilets there. I lived on a rural residential property for about 8 or 9 years outside of Grants Pass. You know, my family, wife, couple of young kids at the time, I think we probably used maybe 200 gallons a day, plenty of showers, laundry and everything. all of that water, there was very little consumptive use of that within the home. So it went into the septic system. A septic system has a drain field, and that is designed to do two things. One, some of the moisture that goes into the drain field is going to be taken up by plants and used through evapotranspiration. Some of it will re-infiltrate into the shallow aquifer system there. So there's not 100% consumptive use by any means. I don't think we have good data for an average system like that as to how much is actually used, but it is important to realize that that in-home use does go into the septic system, and some of it does get back into the aquifer system there. So good question.
And Gretchen also asks, what about groundwater contamination from fracking?
Groundwater contamination in general is a very real issue depending on where you're at. In Oregon, we have had groundwater contamination from any number of commercial or industrial purposes that have lost control of chemicals over the years or have disposed of them improperly. And some of it was just historical practices at the time. They did what was legal and you just dumped it out back. We've got groundwater contamination from failing septic systems that don't properly treat and dispose of that wastewater stream from rural residential homes. Groundwater contamination from large-scale agriculture, over-application of nitrogen fertilizers, over-application of wastewater streams, say from food processing plants. Those are all very real things here in Oregon. Fracking, there's been very little fracking done in the state. The only project I'm aware of, I think, was down in Coos County some years ago, and it was very limited. So I'm not aware of any contamination in the state from fracking at this point in time.
We have a very specific question from Dorman Blazer. He asks, can I use a 1,500 gallon container for collecting surface water to water plants?
You can collect surface water, again, runoff from an artificial impervious surface. So if you're going to collect it off your roof or a concrete driveway, asphalt driveway, something like that, but you're not able to capture overland flow like down in a field as an example and pipe that into a tank and then use it. That would require some sort of a water right from the state, even though it's a relatively small use.
David McMillan stole my question for you here, Ivan. He asks, let's see, how is climate change affecting the department's look at water usage, and what are they doing to prepare for the future?
Great question, Dave. So you've all certainly heard the term climate change. We are struggling right now to address that very issue in our agency. There's a number of state agencies and universities, of course, that are looking at the question, what happens in Oregon as climate change occurs? We largely think that the amount of precipitation is going to remain somewhat similar, but it's going to fall perhaps at different times of the year in a different fashion. We'll have less snowpack and more rain. And as we're seeing with some of these atmospheric rivers that are occurring, we may get large amounts of precipitation in very short periods of time. And that's not really ideal. It creates a lot of runoff, as you're seeing in California with some of the recent flooding in the last couple of weeks. And all of that water happening so quickly, it's not allowed to infiltrate into the aquifer system and recharge that groundwater system as readily. It tends to run off very quickly and flow out down to lakes or the ocean in a very fast sense, and of course can be very damaging. Our agency is trying to deploy more scientific instrumentation. What we're largely responsible for is measuring stream flow over time. We use gauging stations to do that. A lot of our data are telemetered and are available online from our webpage. We also have some budget to drill observation wells around the state and do dedicated groundwater monitoring in different parts of the state where we're doing studies. And we want to be able to combine the groundwater data with the surface water runoff data, along with the precipitation data, to better understand how are the systems responding. Are we seeing more infiltration into the aquifer system as climate changes? Or are we seeing more runoff from the land surface downstream flows? And we need to be able to monitor those data to help us understand that. At the same time that the temperatures are warming up, if you can imagine, if you're gardeners out there, our growing season's expanding. Well, that's great. We can start planting things earlier. We can have, I had raspberries into November this year, so our production can last longer. But if you think about what that means in the water world, our plants are going to be consuming more water to help them through the longer growing season. And that's not only our domesticated plants and the commercial agriculture crops out there, but think about the uplands, the forests, the high desert. All of those plants are going to see a higher demand for water to deal with the warmer temperatures in the longer growing season. And so the natural consumptive use may be increasing in different basins around the state. So good question, Dave.
Suzanne Thornton in our Zoom audience has her hand up with a question. Suzanne?
All right. Thank you so much, Ivan, for this really complete picture about our water and how your organization, the district, we're handling it. My question mainly is about the environmental groups that are wanting to protect our systems. What is the relationship of your organization with those groups? And for instance, the Oregon Wild is promoting this River Democracy Act, and it's supposed to protect the wild and scenic rivers expanded. So are you in connection with that? And what is the relationship you have?
Thanks, Suzanne. That's a good question. So our agency really functions as a neutral party. The only role or power I have, my job, is given to me by the state legislature via statutes. So they write laws that give our Water Resources Commission and my agency director certain powers and authorities to exercise around the state with respect to water management and allocation. We don't pick sides. We try and treat everybody the same. So that includes conservation groups that are very, very focused on maintaining or improving in-stream flows, water quality, wild and scenic waterways, things like that. We hold them at the same level as we do the consumption users out there, municipalities, farmers, ranchers, and others. What we do is we hold open and very frank discussions with them. We have a number of what we call stakeholder meetings every year to brief stakeholders on the agency situation. Where are we at with budget? Do we have any legislative concepts that we're bringing forward? We've got a new legislative session that's going to be starting up here later this month here in Salem. So is our agency seeking any law changes? We're very transparent about that. Some of the stakeholder groups themselves may be working with local legislators to get their own legislative concepts moving forward to seek law changes in different basins around the state or even across the whole state. So we try and work collaboratively and very openly with all of the water users out there to bring everybody along with us so that we get the best decision we can for long-term management here in the state.
Helen, go ahead with your question.
Oh, okay. You mentioned that first of all, that was a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. You mentioned that in many of these areas, you had to go back to 1885 rights. How do these junior members react when you say your water's gone, they're shut off, and how do you enforce that they do shut off their water?
Well, I shouldn't speak that way in public, so I won't. But yeah, there's a lot of, it really depends on the basin you're in and the historical practices. I'm going to use a good example, Baker County, where I lived for 4 years, worked out of the Baker City office. Baker County themselves fund 2 full-time assistant water masters. These are county employees that work with my water master staff. They essentially are state employees funded by the county. And the county tax base out there have found that having extra assistant water master staff to help manage water in times of shortage is a very valuable tool. And again, Oregon being a prior appropriation state, the water goes to the senior users. But at the same time, we want to make sure that the seniors are diverting only that to which they're entitled and that they're not wasting anything. And so having more boots on the ground, professional water master staff out there allows us to kind of squeeze as much beneficial use out of the available supply as we possibly can. So Baker County example again, they've been regulated out there for 100 years. So it's a common understanding. They know based on the snowpack that they have in April, what kind of a water year it's going to be. And there's a general expectation that I can probably expect a call from the water master to shut off my diversion. So it works really well in some basins. In other basins, and this is what we've seen in more recent years with the drought and just more scarcity, we're having to regulate people now that we have not had to regulate in the past. And that's a much rougher conversation. A lot of folks don't know who the water master is. Again, we've only got 23, 24 of them running around the state, so that's not very many. And so the first time that we have to knock on a door and introduce ourselves and let them know that they have a junior water right and the downstream senior needs the water, it's a tough conversation. It could impact their livestock, grazing, commercial gardens, any number of different things. And we're also seeing this, and you probably saw some editorials this past summer. Some of the irrigation districts in the Deschutes Basin have somewhat junior water rights. So entire irrigation districts are having to cut back by 25 or 50% of the amount of water that they're getting. And that's impacting, in some cases, commercial operations of a much larger scale. And so you can see how water shortage can impact small-time operators as much as big commercial operations out there.
Thank you. Thank you for your good work.
You're welcome. Thank you.
But Ivan, thank you so much for an outstanding presentation today.
You're all welcome. Thank you for the invite. Very enjoyable.